E estamos na hora certa, portanto, para não desrespeitar quem chegou à hora, vamos começando lentamente e dando a oportunidade também a quem ainda se vai juntar a nós de o ir fazendo. Chamo-me João Teixeira, sou major da Força Aérea Portuguesa, neste momento no ativo, neste momento colocado na NATO, em Bruxelas, por isso é que assumi também esta função de coordenador do pelouro da EUROMIL, e a proposta hoje para esta reunião temática é efetivamente fazer uma apresentação sobre esta associação. Tenho comigo o Emanuel Jacob, que fez-nos o favor de estar disponível no meio das suas correrias todas, que tem sido uma loucura, para nos acompanhar. Esta apresentação vai ser um misto de português e inglês, portanto o Manu, como nós o tratamos, irá falar inglês, vocês também vão ver slides em inglês, e vão estar intervalados, portanto eu vou fazer uma breve introdução, a seguir o Manu vai apresentar e eu vou atrás dele depois fazer um curto apanhado dessa apresentação, e encaminhando novamente. Para os presentes, só para estarem informados, esta sessão está a ser gravada, a sessão toda vai ser gravada, ou seja, a primeira e a segunda parte, a parte expositiva, que é esta, onde apresentamos com os slides, com o auxílio dos slides, e depois teremos uma segunda parte que é uma troca de ideias, uma discussão, podemos abordar inclusivamente outros assuntos em maior profundidade do que aquilo que nós vamos abordar na apresentação, e essa segunda parte, ainda que seja gravada, não é disponibilizada ao público. Eu vou só informar isto também o Manu, só para garantir que ele sabe. Manu, we are starting the presentation slowly, just to allow for latecomers to arrive, and I'm just letting everybody know, as usual, that this presentation is being recorded, and we will then post this on our online channel. Although it's all being recorded, we will only post online the first part when we are introducing the EUROMIL. The second part, where we will have the discussion, will be only for our archives. Is that okay?
Whatever you want.
Ok. Portanto, se alguém sentir alguma necessidade de interromper, façam-no. Normalmente não é assim que nós funcionamos as nossas sessões, portanto nós expomos, e no final depois temos o debate. No entanto, dada as condições peculiares destas, que irá ter em português e em inglês, se houver alguma coisa que achem que só que se for exposto só no final poderão perder, então interrompam e explicaremos na altura. No entanto, debater um bocadinho mais as ideias, isso será no final. Mota, não sei se queres aproveitar agora para dizer alguma coisa.
Sim, se não se importarem, eu faria uma pequeníssima introdução de saudação basicamente ao Emanuel Jacob, que passo a fazer. Mr. President of EUROMIL, my dear and old friend Emanuel Jacob, on behalf of our office National Council, I'd like to give you a warm welcome to this event and to Portugal, even via Zoom. Also, thank you for another important participation in one of our events, and for all the hard work that EUROMIL has done and is still doing regarding the complaint about the defense of our social rights, the social rights of the Portuguese militaries. Finally, thank you for all the support that you you and your team is giving to our representatives of EUROMIL, on EUROMIL, Major João Teixeira and Lieutenant Rui Martins. Please, if you consider appropriate, transmit these words to the board. As additional information to tell you that today we have among us our President of the General Assembly, Captain of the Sea and War, António Moura, and the President of the Deontological Council, Colonel Jorge Ferreira, and also the Head of the Legal Department of our office, the lawyer Raquel Alves. Thanks once more for your presence. Wishing you and Major João Teixeira a great working session. Thank you.
Thank you, António.
And thanks for having me.
Ok. Bom, obrigado, Mota. Vamos então dar continuidade e quero começar por vos agradecer, dar-vos as boas-vindas e por vos agradecer este bocadinho que estão a dispensar, a retirar às vossas famílias e aos vossos afazeres para estarem aqui a partilhar neste fórum relativamente a uma temática que normalmente não é muito falada, esperemos nós, e a ideia será que ela comece a estar mais na agenda e espero que entendam o porquê no final da apresentação, se é que ainda não o sabem. A sequência que eu vou apresentar, ela foi a sequência com que nós fomos fazendo uns tasers ao longo destas últimas semanas. E o primeiro post em que começámos a apontar para esta apresentação foi com esta história. Era uma vez, numa determinada localização, em certos tempos, num certo emprego, em que alguém assina um determinado contrato. Durante essa candidatura, o patrão toma uma decisão em que é unilateral e altera as condições em que o seu futuro empregado iria ter. No entanto, o candidato já estava num processo de entrada para a empresa e o candidato é meramente informado sem ter sequer a possibilidade de reconsiderar se quer continuar a concorrer a esse cargo ou não. Pronto. Isto que eu coloquei em termos de história, infelizmente isto são casos reais. Não é um caso real, são casos reais. As perguntas que aqui estão, eu espero vê-las respondidas no final desta apresentação, com algum conteúdo, além do que meramente com uma opinião. Então, vamos começar com o que é EUROMIL. Manu, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much.
I will try not to go too quick so that those who understand some English can follow. So once again, thanks for having me with you. Of course, I would have preferred to be with you with most of you in Portugal and not here online, but I'm sure we will see each other in the months or whatever to come, and in the years to come, we will still have a General Assembly meeting in Lisbon. So thanks for this presentation and giving me the opportunity to say a few words and give some explanation on what EUROMIL is and what we are doing. First of all, I want to say that we appreciate the support and the trust from AUFA in EUROMIL and the long-standing collaboration. And I'm sure that this will continue also in the years to come. Now, EUROMIL in a nutshell. This year, we celebrate 50 years EUROMIL. On the 13th of September, as you know, we will celebrate in a more formal way 50 years EUROMIL, because 13 September 1972 is exactly the moment that EUROMIL has been founded in Germany, in Bergisch Gladbach, and we want to celebrate that at the same place where EUROMIL has been founded, but we will also celebrate that afterwards at the General Assembly in October in Berlin, of course. We know that Bergisch Gladbach is not evident to travel to, There are anyway no Germans online. Bergisch Gladbach is in the middle of nowhere in Germany. But I think if our founding fathers could get in Bergisch Gladbach in 1972, that we will manage in 2022. Now, for the moment, EUROMIL has 33 member associations. They are military associations and trade unions. We will come back later in the presentation on the main difference between these two. So EUROMIL is an umbrella organization. EUROMIL as such is no social partner, is no trade union or military association, but composed several military associations and trade unions, 33 for the moment, and in 20 European countries. I think it's also important to underline that the statute, the charter of EUROMIL, is quite clear on that. It has to be military associations or trade unions, but it is limited also to the European geographical Europe and not to the European Union. Sometimes there is a misunderstanding on that. We are geographical European countries with our member associations. Now, the principle that since 1972 EUROMIL is defending is the principle of citizen in uniform. Now, what is this principle of citizen in uniform? Once again, a link with Germany. It's a principle that has been installed by the new German armed forces after the Second World War. And the citizen in uniform principle means that in this new German armed forces, there was, and in the German society after the Second World War, there was this wish that armed forces should never again be something outside of society, but should be part of society. And so this idea has been created, and until today, we defend this principle, and it's a principle which is now studied a little bit all over the world, but not implemented all over the world. That's quite clear. So that's what EUROMIL is for the moment. Are you going to the next slide, or do you want to go slide by slide?
I'm going as soon as you want. I can slide it.
Yeah, okay. So what is EUROMIL standing for? I said that we defend this principle of the citizen in uniform. Of course, there are no clear lines where we say, okay, this is what EUROMIL is there for. That's in the statute, just like in every organization, the goals of the organization are in the statute. But what, if you ask me what are the main topics, what EUROMIL is calling for, first of all, of course, equal rights and treatment of soldiers, of military personnel. That's, of course, our basic thing, what we defend together with our member associations. The second thing, and you will see later in the presentation that this is not only coming back by EUROMIL, but also by the Committee Social Rights, it's the right for service people, for military personnel, to form and join trade unions or independent, what they call staff associations, professional associations, to defend their rights. So if you don't have the right to organize yourself, then you are an individual, and defending your rights is becoming quite difficult. And then last but not least, of course, and their EU is anyway coming back, it's the inclusion of military personnel into European Union social and labor legislation. Now, this can be a little bit strange because I said before that we are geographical Europe for member associations, but when it comes to social rights, we ask for the inclusion in the EU social and labor legislation. The reason is quite simple. The reason is because, this is the only international framework where you can find a certain number social and labor legislation. We are also coming back on that later in the presentation. Yeah, next one. So what are we doing together with our member associations? Because I said we are an umbrella organization, but we have a national member association. So what is now the link between the two? Well, the link is that, first of all, we deliver the platform to our national member associations to exchange experiences. Now, this exchanging experiences, learning from each other, is quite important. At the point where we are now, for example, a problem that you could face in Portugal, you can be sure that you are not the only one in Europe facing this problem. The same problem exists in Denmark, in Norway, in Finland, in Ireland. Just to take one example, recruitment and retention. This is something which is for the moment a problem all over Europe in the armed forces. So exchanging experiences in this field between member associations is quite important. This does not mean that EUROMIL wants to teach lessons to member associations. Member associations learn from each other, use experiences from each other, and try to use it for their own benefit on the national level. And this brings me to the second part of this work that we are doing. It's supporting you in your national lobby work. Now, we call it here lobby work because we know that not in all countries, and also this is a part of our discussion, a regulated social dialogue is not existing. So if you don't have a regulated social dialogue, then you have to work through lobbying. That's what we also need to do, for example, on the level of the European Parliament, because there is no social dialogue installed for military personnel. So we try to do this through lobby work. Now, for the moment, what are the main things that we are dealing with as umbrella organization, or just like people like to say it, a Brussels-based organization? It's clear that what we closely follow as umbrella organization are the developments going on in NATO and the European Union. Now, NATO, of course, this is less on the level of military personnel. The European Union is more, because there you have this social legislation coming. Even though that I would say, don't underestimate the contexts that are needed with NATO. For example, NATO is very much working on gender perspective in the armed forces, for example. So there it's anyway quite important. For the moment, what is, if I should say, an hot topic, and this will not only be for the moment, this will be for the years to come, is the creation of this European Defence Union. Don't mix it with this strange idea of a European army. This is something that doesn't exist. I suppose it will not exist in the years to come, but you never know. But very clearly, we are going to much more collaboration on the European level. And this is this European Defence Union, even if it's not clearly defined at the moment. Now, there is, for the moment, since a little bit less than a month, there is a quite important instrument which is now on the table. This is what the European Union called the Strategic Compass. So the Strategic Compass is the new tool of the European Union, to put it in a nutshell, to bring this European Defence Union, this collaboration on a much higher level. There will, for example, also be by 2025 kind of deployed capability. This means that our people on the European level will work much more together than ever before, and we will continue and push for a discussion to bring in this discussion also the social aspect. Now, at the same moment, and this will happen in June, NATO will decide on a new strategic concept. There is already an older one, but there will be a new one. And at the same time, in the second part of the year, European Union and NATO will have a new declaration They don't really join together, but there will be a new declaration. And so we have to put everything in work and in place, that this strategic compass from the European Union, strategic compass from NATO, that we find there our point of discussion concerning military personnel. And so this is what we are especially working on for the moment, what we are monitoring on, and where we will bring our member associations or representative of member associations together. I think we do a first meeting and the end of June, the 30th, I think, where we will have a discussion with our representatives of the member associations on how are we trying to tackle this in the near future. So that's what we are, and that's what we are working on for the moment. Back to you, Tex.
Thank you very much. Fazendo um apanhado muito ligeiro e muito pobre de tudo o que o Manu acabou de dizer. Portanto, a EUROMIL surgiu em 1972, tem neste momento 33 organizações, das quais de 20 países. Os membros são da Europa e trata de um conceito que tem origens na Alemanha, que é o Citizen in Uniforms, portanto, cidadãos de uniforme. Eu, curiosamente, isto dizem que não há coincidências, mas às vezes há, deparei-me hoje com um artigo precisamente sobre ética, leadership, Ethics and Armed Forces Leadership Culture in Camouflage. Isto foi um artigo com que eu me deparei hoje e que trata exatamente disto que o Manu acabou de falar, de Citizens in Uniforms e desta política alemã. Eu, nos próximos dias, irei partilhar no Facebook da OFA e enviaremos depois também internamente este artigo. Está em inglês, mas é bastante interessante. Como puderam perceber da abordagem do Manu, são associações militares, associações aos sindicatos, e que tratam sobretudo de direitos sociais dos militares. Com mais ou menos ferramentas, há alturas em que existem ferramentas concretas para o fazer e há outras alturas em que o lobby pode ser uma palavra muito forte ou desagradável, mas no fundo o lobby não é mais do que influência, é isso que se tenta exercer. Ora, relativamente, portanto, andando cronologicamente nas nossas semanas, o próximo teaser foi relativamente aos membros e à afiliação da EUROMIL, e é o próximo tema que vamos abordar. Manu, back to you.
Yeah.
So here I can talk an hour only about this slide, but we are not going to do that. So these are the countries and the member association in the countries. So as you can see, we have there on the right below, we have 3 observer member associations. So before you become a full member of EUROMIL, you can ask, and then it's becoming a rule. It's not an obligation, but it's really an habit now. Before you become a full member, associations are first observer, which is a way on learning to work together with EUROMIL. And in the past, it already happened that an observer, after a while, said, EUROMIL is not really what we are looking for, or that we said, sorry, but that's not really the kind of collaboration that we need. So we have 3 observers for the moment, and there are 2 of them are quite specific. There I need to say a word on it. The first one from Ireland, RDFRA. It's the only association that we have for the moment in EUROMIL, even if it's an observer, only composed by reserve military personnel. So these are reservists So not people coming from the regular armed forces, but really reserve military personnel. Is a discussion that we need to have in EUROMIL, which way we are going with that. EUROMIL, it's a normal Italian association, but just joined recently. And then OMVTO, that's a veteran association. Also there, we need to look how we're going to do that in the future, because there exists a World Veteran Federation with whom we have a good relation. But in a matter of fact, they are not working on the social rights for the veterans. So at that point, they are quite particular. So, but as you see, we have members in Belgium, Bulgaria, Cyprus. I'm not going through the whole thing. When you look at the countries where we have associations, then you see that a certain number of them are missing. Norway is missing, but we have a contact with associations in Norway. Finland is missing, but also in contact. Russia and Ukraine are missing. We had them as members in the past, but once that the problems started in 2014 between Ukraine and Russia, we lost both these associations. Then we are missing associations in Austria and Switzerland, more in the center. The UK, and the reason is quite simple, because the UK does not have associations in the framework of EUROMIL. They exist simply not in the UK. And then you have a few Balkan countries which are also missing because there are no associations. And then there is one big spot where we don't have an association for the moment. That's in France, but that's because France is still building up military associations. This is completely new in the past years, but most probably we will have an observer from France by the end of the year. So the associations that you have there for the moment, these 30 because 3 are an observer, are as well, some of them military trade unions, while other ones are military professional associations. We come back immediately in a few minutes on the big difference between the two of them. But this gives you an overview. Some of them are quite big. If you look, for example, to the German association, Deutsche Bundeswehrverband, DBWV, that's an association with 200,000 members. If you look, for example, to Bulgaria, BOAFA, that's an association with only 100 members. The reason is quite simple. For example, BOAFA is an organization which was composed originally only by women. And now they are changing and then getting really a military professional association. Other ones are quite old. If you look to the ones of the Netherlands, for example, they started more than 100 years ago building up associations, not trade unions. Meanwhile, both of them are officially trade unions, but in the first 70 years, they worked as a military association. The same with the Danish ones, CS and HKKF. At the origin, they were military associations. Meanwhile, they are established trade unions. And so has every country is history and the way of building up. If you look, and that's the last one that I will use now, for example, to the Irish colleagues, we have there 2 professional associations, PD4A and RACO. Well, recently, last week, PD4A became member of a trade union federation in Ireland. RACO will do this step in the weeks to come. But the past 25 years, they were working as a professional association. Next slide. So EUROMIL, EUROMIL needs also partners to work with. Because first of all, what we do, we cover our work and we focus on a specific element, the social rights, human rights, fundamental freedoms. But of course, being a European umbrella organization, we need also some partners to cover other things. That's why we are a member as organization of, for example, the European Movement International. I think that there is also a branch of the European movement in Portugal. They are more dealing with European integration, but we are there the one dealing with defense matters in their framework. Kangaroo Group is something very specific. It's an organization internally in the European Parliament. We are one of the only civil society, if you have to call it like this, organizations that are a member of the Kangaroo Group. Friends of Europe is a quite big organization in Brussels. It's a bit like the European Movement International, especially working on European integration and all the aspects which are related to the European Union. But we need also cooperation. And cooperation, one of the things that we cooperate now is GMAC. GMAC is a specific organization dealing with climate and security. I told you that we are now much dealing with this European Defense Union. This will be something on our agenda for the years to come. But climate and security also. Climate is getting more and more important, not in society alone, but also security related. I'm just coming back 2 hours ago from the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in Lithuania. Well, at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, which was a huge discussion now on climate, has never been discussed before. And even the link climate, security, gender perspectives. So this is getting much more important, and GMAC is one of these organizations specifically dealing with that. DCAF, OSCE, ODIHR, ECOAF, these are three organizations mainly dealing with human rights and democracy in the armed forces. DCAF is an organization in Geneva, democratic control on the armed forces. The word says it itself. ECOAF is the yearly meeting of and this is a world organization, but organized by DCAF and OSCE ODIHR on the military ombuds institutions. A quite important link. We are there the only non-ombuds institute in this meeting. The OSCE, we all know the OSCE, but the OSCE has a specific institute, ODIHR, and this specific institute is dealing with, that's the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. And they are very much dealing with human rights in the armed forces and focusing especially on new democracies. So with them, we work a lot together. And I can put there several associations, but I put, for example, IGBU, because IGBU is something very specific. It's an organization on uranium weapons. Now, uranium weapons is one of the problems that we had, for example, in the Balkan region. It's a problem that we are dealing with in Italian armed forces. They have quite some victims of uranium weapons. And this is one of these very specific situations where two kinds of organizations, which normally don't fit together, work together. And when I say don't fit together, I mean IGBU is an organization for the ban of uranium weapons. So you can imagine, and that's reality, that quite some people at IGBU are people dealing with peace, no war, no weapons, and we are the military. Well, but in protecting military personnel, we find each other. Now we have also a certain number of official statuses. We have this status of participatory status at the Council of Europe. You know that beside the European Union, you also have the Council of Europe, which are much more countries. We are coming to almost 50. So that is much bigger than the European Union, with a parliamentary assembly 4 times a year in Strasbourg. And there we have this participatory status, which gives us the right, what we are doing for the moment for Portugal, to introduce, for example, collective complaints against a country. So this is very important to keep this status. We are waiting anxious this week for the confirmation, because every 4 years we need to renew the status, and it's this week that the decision will be taken if we get the status again for the next 4 years, but normally it should be no problem. Then we are, and I put it between brackets, lobbyists at the European Union institutions. Officially, this calls being in the transparency register. The term is lobbyist because this means that by the fact that we are in this register of the European Union, we have access and we may lobby the European institutions, meaning the European Parliament, the European Commission, contacts with the European Court of Justice, everything which is around the European Union. We are recognized officially. We have there a number, and so we can join their work and deal with that. And then, as I said, I'm just coming back from the NATO PA. We have an observer status, which is not a really official status because it's an individual invitation that we get by the chairman of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. But we have this since at least 25 years, this status. And then it's important to keep the status. Just to give you an example, my first NATO Parliamentary Assembly meeting was in 2009. And then we had something like 15 pages of observers. Last weekend, or the past days, we were with 15 observers in Vilnius. That's it. So these 15 pages is now 15 organizations or individuals that are still an observer. So it's important to keep this status. Once again, not because NATO is so much dealing with personnel, but the members of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly are individual members from national parliaments. So for our lobby status, it's quite important to keep that network. And that's what we need. We need a network. That's the most important. And with this whole package that we here have on the screen, our network is quite broad. Back to you.
Thank you, Manu. Portanto, fazendo mais uma vez um apanhado ligeiro daquilo que o Manu nos apresentou, portanto, dos 20 países que temos, e isto era o nosso slide, obviamente aqui com um bocadinho de brincadeira, acho que é fácil descobrir qual é o país que falta aqui, e o Manu claramente nos explicou mais detalhadamente por país as diversas organizações e associações e algumas características dela, bem como da importância de fazermos parte, por um lado nós, associação da EUROMIL, e por outro lado da EUROMIL fazer esta rede de contactos a um nível europeu e com bastante destaque e peso. De salientar que aqueles estatutos que são adquiridos pela EUROMIL, quando o Manu falou em renovar, alguns estatutos eles não são renováveis única e exclusivamente por nós pedirmos. Há estatutos que só são renovados mediante ações, portanto a EUROMIL tem que demonstrar através de ações, o seu envolvimento com assuntos de cariz, da dinâmica social e dos militares. Portanto, este esforço e esta preocupação que ele falou é algo que tem que ser concretizado em ações. Passando para outro tema, social rights. Manu, back to you.
Well, social rights.
We already said in the beginning that defending social rights is one of the core businesses of EUROMIL, and making sure that military personnel is not excluded from social directives. As you know, on the level of the European Union, you have social directives coming from the European Union. This means that they are decided by what they call tripartite, meaning the European Parliament, the European Commission, and then the countries, the European Council. So finally, in whatever the European Union is deciding, also in these directives, the final word is by the member states. And so member states decide on the European level in what they often call framework directives. And then it's up to the member states, the countries, to put these framework directives in national legislation. One of the typical ones is what we discussed last week in Paris, is the working time directive. That's not new. There was already a directive in 91. Then there came a new one in 2003. Well, still today, not all countries have implemented that for military personnel. And that's just because one of the reasons is that in this directive, there is a possibility for countries to exclude or limit the rights of military personnel. And that's now just something that we do on the European level. We try to avoid that military personnel, avoid or limit that military personnel is or can be excluded in social directives in the countries. And then this is still happening today. And it happens quite regularly that on the level of the European Union, and then especially by the Council, meaning the member states, that there is a possibility to exclude military personnel. It's not the European Commission that tries to do it. It's mostly the member states. And then you have the problem that you don't know exactly who did it, because what the Council decides is not transparent. You don't have minutes, you don't have a public discussion on what member states do. But social rights need to be implemented in the countries. And this goes through what they call a social dialogue. A social dialogue, some countries call it a social dialogue, other calls it collective bargaining, other calls it negotiation, trade union consultation. It all belongs under this umbrella of social dialogue, meaning a dialogue between social partners, trade unions, professional associations, and authorities, governments. And how this happens is something that the countries can decide. Later, we come back on the European level, but this is decided by the countries how they deal with that. Now, such a social dialogue exists since many years. Others quite recently for military personnel in several European countries. Austria has such a dialogue. Belgium has one. Just to give you an example, in Belgium, the legislation on social dialogue with military personnel is a legislation from 1978, and it's only in 1995, 17 years later, that this legislation has been put in place and implemented. So the authorities that had a legislation, but took almost 20 years to say, okay, now we're going to work with it. Now, if you look to Denmark, Finland, these are countries with a very specific social dialogue. And there is no discussion on the military if they have military in the social dialogue or not. Denmark implement this for everybody. Finland has a very specific system. You can have, for example, in Finland, a social dialogue for a group of only 50 people. For example, there was not so long ago in Finland a social dialogue, and that was dealing with a specific situation of the, now I have to be correct, the officers of the IT sector of the military coming from the military academy. Exactly 50 people. Well, they had a specific social dialogue only for that group. But this is the Finnish system, and you should not copy it and implement it. It only works in Finland. Now, Germany has a very specific social dialogue because, and this is even a problem for the trade unions from the public sector, there is no general overall social dialogue in Germany. This is very much sector related. And there's also the military. And even more specifically for the military is that this discussion is done at the parliament, but that there is a decree that stipulates that whatever the parliament decides concerning military personnel, it should be discussed also by the German Association of Military Personnel. And this sometimes makes then a friction between the established trade unions and the military organization. Now, the Netherlands has a social dialogue since decades. And once again, Norway, Sweden. So what you see is specifically Central Europe and North Europe has a well-established, has a social dialogue, while it's less in the southern part and also less in the east part, except for Hungary, which we didn't mention here. Now, there is what we call a three-step system. Now, EUROMIL defends this three-step system, but in a matter of fact, it's also something which is used by the Committee Social Rights. Committee Social Rights is this famous committee from the Council of Europe, which is dealing with that collective complaint now going on against Portugal. And in a case from 3 years ago, meanwhile, 2018, from trade union CGIL against Italy for military personnel, the Committee Social Rights also used these 3 steps. And what is these 3 steps? The 3 steps is that the first point is, and that's the basic right, that you should be able to form and join military associations or trade unions. We come back on that later on, which is the difference between the two, but there is no real definition to make a difference between the two. And so that's the fundamental right. Step 1, organize yourself. Step 2 is, if you organize yourself, that you should be able to have this social dialogue or collective bargaining. That's now exactly the reason of the complaint against Portugal. You have step 1, but you don't have step 2. There is no regulated social dialogue or collective bargaining. And then step 3, that's the tricky one. Step 3 is, and we did never take position as EUROMIL in the past, but we are pushed now by the Committee Social Rights since this decision. Step 3 is that if you have step 1 and you can organize yourself, you have step 2, there should be a social dialogue or collective bargaining. Then the Committee of Social Rights says, if these are not working and you can not have sufficient structures for this collective bargaining, then you should be able to react. And this react is through, and I use the nice word, industrial action. The industrial action, in a matter of fact, means strike. Now, this is something which is always tricky. Talking about the right to strike in the military. And so this is something where we are not really defending. It's not something that we are promoting. But on the other hand, it's an article in the Social Charter. Social Charter, Article 5, Article 6, has the same points: right of association, social dialogue, and industrial action, or the right to strike. But once again, we have a position paper on the right to strike since that decision of the European Committee on Social Rights. But also the Committee of Social Rights doesn't really know what to do with this right to strike. Everybody understands that it's something that is very difficult to implement. You cannot, it's hard to mix, even if there are a few countries having the right to strike. Sweden has it for the military. North Macedonia has it for the military. The Danish and the Dutch had it, but have an agreement never to implement it. And so they have what they call sympathy strikes. This means that other workers can strike for military personnel. But once again, this third point, it exists, it's there, we have a position on it, but it's not something that we promote or defend. But this is the way that social rights should be built up, and the fight for social rights, the collective bargaining should be built up, and that's what we are doing for the moment for Portugal, and what we did successfully for Ireland in the past. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Manu. O Manu teve, portanto, aqui a apresentar a tipologia na Europa. Eu não vou resumir grande coisa daquilo que ele disse, porque ele teve a apresentar uma série de casos, mas vou-me focar um bocadinho no nosso caso. Okay? Temos aqui hoje connosco duas pessoas que já fizeram aqui outras reuniões temáticas, e eu vou-me lançar um bocadinho para fora de pé, portanto, fazendo já aqui o meu disclaimer que isto é uma abordagem de um leigo, mas que tem como público-alvo alguém que, à partida, não será tão conhecedor da matéria como um advogado ou um jurista. Bom, nós da nossa Constituição da República temos como princípios orientadores a dignidade da pessoa humana e a igualdade. A função dos direitos sociais tem como função reduzir as desigualdades em diversos campos, nomeadamente a título de exemplo, a saúde, a proteção da parentalidade, férias, horário de trabalho, etc. A Constituição portuguesa está organizada desta maneira, okay? E vemos que na parte 1 chama-se Direitos e Deveres Fundamentais, depois vemos os diversos títulos, em que no título 3, Deveres e Direitos Económicos, Sociais e Culturais, continuamos a subdividir por capítulos, Direitos e Deveres Sociais, e cada artigo vai abordar explicitamente alguns, e eu coloquei aqui estes de propósito: a saúde, o ambiente e a qualidade de vida, a família, a paternidade e a maternidade. Ora, para não ser tendencioso, porque sou militar e às vezes é difícil ser advogado em causa própria, eu andei à procura de uma outra entidade que me falasse sobre os direitos sociais dos militares. E foi na Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos, uma fundação que tem bastante credibilidade, que é isenta, portanto não tem a ligação militar. O link do artigo está aí abaixo se alguém quiser ver. Foi aqui que encontrei um artigo relativamente aos direitos sociais dos militares, em que aborda precisamente no seu texto que sim, os militares têm direitos, contudo com algumas restrições. nomeadamente liberdade de expressão, direito de reunião e de manifestação, direito de associação, direito de greve, direito de petição coletiva, capacidade eleitoral passiva. No entanto, foram perfeitamente claros também, está explícito, que estas restrições devem ser na medida do necessário. Okay? Então o texto, a condição militar, este texto da condição militar, isto leva-nos a outro tópico que eu não quero entrar aqui hoje e que já foi alvo de uma reunião temática, que é o tema da condição militar, em que, quando nós abordamos esta nossa conversa sobre os direitos sociais, isto é muitas vezes confundido com o subsídio de condição militar. Portanto, os meus direitos sociais são, de certa forma, substituídos por um subsídio, um suplemento, como se quiser chamar, de condição militar. No entanto, esta definição aqui, mais uma vez, desta fundação que não tem qualquer ligação com os militares, a condição militar implica estar sujeito a um conjunto alargado de deveres, subordinados ao interesse nacional, mas também beneficiar de um conjunto de direitos especiais, compensações, segurança social, assistência, etc., etc. E é no artigo 270 da Constituição da República, portanto, que é o livro máximo de onde nós vamos ler os nossos direitos e deveres, que a lei pode estabelecer as restrições ao exercício dos direitos, etc., etc., e fala explicitamente de não admissão do direito à greve, mesmo quando reconhecido o direito da associação sindical. Aquilo que, na verdade, e nós vamos lá chegar dentro de dois pontos, aquilo que muitas das vezes se fala e, na minha opinião, assusta um bocadinho quando se fala em associativismo ou sindicalismo, é este papão da greve. E que, como o Manu acabou de dizer, na verdade, aquilo que faz sentido e a nossa ferramenta para conseguirmos fazer valer os nossos direitos sociais, os nossos como indivíduos e os nossos como militares, porque o militar é um indivíduo, poderá ser exatamente esta negociação coletiva. No entanto, esta negociação coletiva está muitas vezes associada ao papão da greve, e isto, na verdade, a greve para nós não tem grande expressão, não é esta a ferramenta que se pretende quando se fala e se advoca em direitos sociais e em negociação coletiva. Vamos tocar isto um bocadinho mais lá à frente. Portanto, respondendo à provocação que também foi feita num outro teaser, foi se os militares têm os mesmos direitos que os outros. Claro que têm, aplicando-se as restrições do artigo 270 da Constituição. Agora vamos abordar a diferença entre associativismo e sindicalismo. Manu, back to you.
Yeah. So when we were
Going through the member associations that we have in EUROMIL, and during the whole expose that we are giving, we use very often these two different kind of associations: military associations or trade unions, syndicate organizations, because syndicate trade unions in English, it's the same. Now, what is the difference? I already told you before that there is no real international definition of these things. It depends a little bit on national legislation. And so to be sure and to get out of the discussion, we asked 2-3 years ago, we asked the International Labour Organization, ILO, for their point of view. Now, ILO is for the United Nations, and then we are talking about almost 200 countries, 193 if I'm not mistaken. It's the highest world level that you can find dealing with labor aspects. And so the ILO in Geneva gave us an answer. And in a matter of fact, what the ILO says is that the main difference, what you can find, is the way how unions can be engaged in this collective bargaining and recognized as what they call then a mutual respected social partner. Now, this can be done in certain countries also by a non-trade union, but by a professional association. So from the start, the difference is that a professional association has less competences than a trade union in social dialogue. But once again, in some countries, but very limited, also professional associations can deal with that. But the main and most important thing is that, and only then ILO says, then you can see that a professional association, even if they have another name or another status, can be seen as a trade union, is that their social dialogue should lead to what they call collective binding agreements. And that's the part that is missing in several situations. And to be honest and to be fair, this is also even missing in a certain number of countries where military associations have the status of a trade union. For example, Slovenia has constitutional trade union rights for military personnel. They have a certain number of military in-name trade unions, but they don't have collective bargaining. So the name is not always exactly what is behind. But in a nutshell, if you really have to see what is the main difference, and that's what we use as view for member associations, military associations versus trade unions, is the big difference is the less competences in a military association can represent military personnel, but in general, not through collective bargaining, not through social dialogue, and surely not, and that's the main thing for both of them, surely not leading to collective binding agreements. So this last part is very, very, very important. For example, in several countries, a legislation, even if approved by the parliament, is not acceptable if it is not coming through collective binding agreements. And this depends on, once again, on the country. This is not something that you can say this is in whole Europe the case, or this should be copied by other countries. This is simply not working because this has to do by the way how countries establish legislation. That's, for example, a big discussion with the Danish colleagues in Denmark is a very specific system of how collective agreements are made, how legislation is made, but you cannot copy it and implement it in another country because it simply doesn't fit in the culture and in the system of the country. Now I can show you on the map, if you give the next slide, how this looks for military associations for the moment. This is the case in Europe. If you put in Europe for the military, of course, if you put colors on it, then in green, these are the countries where you have military trade unions. In yellow, these are the ones with military associations, not trade unions. And in red, that's the countries where it's not regulated. Now, let me say from the start that this is pure based on legislation. If you look now, for example, I told you that since last week, one of the two Irish associations has joined a trade union federation. This should be then in Ireland in red, officially. In reality, not really, but I'm not going too much in detail to make it not too complicated. But in Ireland, what this association received now is the agreement to join the federations, but only for the discussion on salaries. So they have now trade union rights, but still not fully implemented. If you look to Italy, Italy is in yellow now. Italy was until a month and a half ago red. There is a new legislation in Italy based on a decision of the Constitutional Court in April 2018. And now finally, after 4 years of discussion, the Italian Parliament, Senate and Chamber of Deputies decided that in Italy you can have now military associations with a trade union character, whatever this may be. This means that you can organize yourself in associations. They call themselves unions, but they are not really unions because there is no collective bargaining and they have less competences. If you look to Russia, if you look to Ukraine, they are both in green. You have military trade unions in both countries, but the competences on both levels are very limited. If you look to the UK, I told you that there are no military professional associations nor trade unions. Even if you see there that it's in green, because the legislation in the United Kingdom does not forbid military personnel to join trade unions. But nobody joins a trade union for the simple reason that trade unions have no competences in the armed forces. So why should you join a trade union if they don't have competences in the armed forces? Why should you buy a car if you may not drive on the road with your car? And that's what's happening in the UK. So you see that the color is not only the real main thing to say this works in a country or it's not working in a country. If you look there to Greece, for example, Greece is in green, but for example, the association in Greece works as a trade union, but cannot join the trade union federations. A little bit like the organization before had in Ireland. So once again, this green, yellow, red, it's not always really what it seems to be, but it gives an indication, and the indication is, once again, that especially in Central Europe and in the northern part of Europe, you have much more trade union rights, while in the southern part, you have mainly the right of association, finally the right of association, but not trade union rights yet. And we hope that with the case that we have for the moment against Portugal, that we will have a breakthrough in the southern part, because the only real trade union that you have for the moment, and you cannot almost even see it on the map because it's so small, is Malta having trade union rights for the military, but there are only 1,200 or something in the military in Malta, but they have trade union rights. Back to you.
Thank you, Manu.
No, I still have one, I think. No? No, afterwards.
No.
Sorry.
Will be the next one.
Yeah, sorry.
Portanto, a grande diferença entre o associativismo e o sindicalismo, de uma forma muito simplista novamente, será a capacidade de negociação coletiva, que o Manu explicou os diversos cenários na Europa, e que nos vai levar efetivamente ao último ponto. Manu, this one is the one you're looking for.
Yeah, that was the one. So we already talked about military associations and trade unions. now this plays also a role on the European level, of course, by the fact that in quite some countries we don't have military trade unions, but military associations, doesn't make it evident, if I have to say it in this way, for EUROMIL to be part of the European trade union world. Even if, as you most probably know, that we now have finally, since a bit like half a year, we have now our offices in the building of the International Trade Union Confederation, partnering with the European Trade Union Confederation. But you most probably also know that we try to become a federation of the European Trade Union Confederation, and that this still creates a problem. And one of the reasons is this thing between military associations versus trade unions. Now, to be fair, military personnel is not everywhere in the real trade unions accepted as being workers and defended by the trade unions. So at that point, there is still a lot of work to do. Now, on the European level, and that's what we want, that's why we absolutely want to become a federation of the European Trade Union Confederation. It's because on the European level, you have this kind of collective bargaining by the trade union confederations and the employer confederations. So this is a little bit the copy of what exists on the national level, but up to the European level. So this European Trade Union Confederation and a few confederations of employers have also this social dialogue on the European level. And then we really want to represent military personnel on the level of the European Trade Union Confederations. Now, what are the instruments, as already said, that need to be used? Once again, you have the European treaties on the functioning of the European Union. You have one European treaty, the main treaty on the functioning, but then based on that treaty, you have then later on, you have sub-treaties and you have directives. And what is happening is that countries, member states of the European Union, not always implement what they signed in the treaty. A little bit like you sign a lease contract for your house, but you don't fulfill the conditions afterwards, and then you get in a conflict. That's exactly the same. Now, I already told you that beside the European Union, you also have the Council of Europe, much more member states. Now, the Council of Europe is not working with these directives that has to be implemented, but this famous European Social Charter is coming from the Council of Europe. And so it's this social charter where the main articles are the Article 5 and 6 on labor relations, meaning right of association, social dialogue, industrial action. And these Articles 5 and 6 are exactly the ones that we use in the collective complaint now for Portugal, in the past for Ireland. So also this European Social Charter, countries signed it, ratified it, because first you sign such an agreement, and then it's ratified on the level of the parliament. Very specific for the Social Charter is that there are sub-charters that should be ratified, for example, for collective complaints, and Portugal signed that one. And then it's binding for the country. And then you have what I already said on the level of the United Nations, the UN. You have this famous International Labour Organization, and also the International Labour Organization has conventions. And in these conventions, you have several ones on the right of association, on the social dialogue, also these conventions are then binding for countries. So this means that we have a European social dialogue with unions, representatives, and employer representatives. And then you have several kind of bodies, the European Union, but also the Council of Europe, also the United Nations, where you have tools that you can use to get your rights recognized by the countries. Now, in this social dialogue, once again, they are discussing on employment. They are talking about pay, but not on real salary. But for example, one of the discussions going on for the moment on the highest level, that's again European Union, is one of the examples is minimum wages. Now you can think that, for example, a discussion on minimum wages has absolutely nothing to do with the military or military personnel. Well, think wrong, because we still have in a certain number of places where the basic salary for military personnel is below the minimum wages. So such a discussion is important. Pay is also related to working time. I told you before that in quite some European countries, working time not implemented for military personnel, meaning that overtime, weekend work, night shift, and then go on, is not always compensated or not compensated in the right way. And so the best tool is once again this negotiation, social dialogue between social partners and working conditions. And so what we want on the European level is that this can also happen at a certain moment for military personnel. And that's for the moment not the case. And the reason is quite simple. On the European level, you have what I said, these trade unions and employers on the highest level. But you have for the moment also what they call sectorial dialogue committees. There are 41, but there is none for the military. And the reason is simple. The reason is that you should have to install such a social dialogue committee, a sectorial one. You must have two partners. Military personnel, in our case, military personnel, and EUROMIL could be there, the umbrella of trade unions and professional associations for military personnel. And then you should have the employer side, and that's what's problematic. There is no European umbrella employers for military personnel. Now, you could say we have the EU military staff, we have the EU military committee, and go on, but they are not dealing with personnel. These are a kind of not even operational bodies. And so this means that there is no social dialogue going on for military personnel. And this is the aim that we have for the future, to get to install in the social dialogue of the public sector a specific discussion forum which can relate to military personnel on the European level. And that's why the link with this future European Defense Union is so important. If you look to how things work, once that you have European employers, there must be also a European social dialogue. Once that you have European soldiers, and we will not have a European army tomorrow, that's very clear. But if we have a deployable capability, which is paid, and this will be in the near future the case, there will be money available for this rapid deployment capability, then the discussion is open if we should not go for a social dialogue for military personnel. So the whole game between European Defence Union, working conditions is open in the years to come. And that's important to play. But once again, the main force today is still on the national matter, on the national level. So a national matter is for example, typical is wages. Wages is something is not being dealt with on the European level, even if, for example, minimum wages is a European point of discussion. But it's still today on the national level. So we need there to work together with the national partners and see how this is working in the future. And if it continues like it's the case today, that military personnel is very often dealt with in the framework of the public sector, then we have to be aware that this public sector can put limitations for military personnel, and so the circle is round. Military personnel very often linked to the public sector, but public sector can give limitations for certain functions or specific tasks, and so we are back to square one. Military personnel not always represented in the way that we need. So at this point we turn around and we need absolutely to find a way in breaking through this discussion, and then we come to the point what EUROMIL is defending, that military personnel, that they are workers just like everybody else, but in uniform and need to be represented in the proper way. That's our point. And now back to you.
Thank you, Manu. Passando agora a uma abordagem um bocadinho diferente daquilo que o Manu teve a falar do contexto europeu. Normalmente, quando se fala na negociação coletiva, nós voltamos ao fantasma da greve, mas associamos aos privilegiados, associamos, não nós, que estamos informados, mas eventualmente quem não está, aos privilegiados do Estado que só fazem greve porque os empregos estão seguros e, portanto, não há problema nenhum. E fiz questão de colocar aqui duas notícias relativamente recentes, onde as greves e a negociação coletiva está a acontecer através da ferramenta da greve, precisamente em duas gigantes internacionais, como a Ryanair e a Amazon. E, portanto, mais uma vez, apenas para desconstruir um bocadinho a ideia e o fantasma, quer da greve, quer da negociação coletiva, quer dos privilegiados do Estado relativamente a este conceito de negociação coletiva. Portanto, é efetivamente um processo que se desenvolve entre as associações e, neste caso, as entidades, o governo, de forma a que se consigam negociar as condições sociais. O Manu, entretanto, já abordou, nós na segunda parte podemos discutir um bocadinho mais sobre esta queixa coletiva, se for do interesse de alguém, mas agora, durante esta primeira parte, não o vamos fazer, porque o processo ainda está a correr, portanto não é de todo conveniente que seja uma discussão pública, por respeito a ambas as partes, mas isto, fiz questão de colocar aqui uma notícia da nossa comunicação social, em que a EUROMIL fez efetivamente uma queixa contra Portugal, precisamente por não nos ser dado a possibilidade, o direito social de termos negociação coletiva para vermos as nossas condições sociais, laborais, efetivamente melhoradas através dessa ferramenta. Estamos a chegar ao fim e terminamos então da forma como começamos, que é com exatamente a mesma história e tentando responder aqui a estas perguntas. Ora, nós começámos por ver, dentro do enquadramento desta apresentação, começámos por ver o que é a EUROMIL, para quem não conhecia esta associação. Vimos que é uma associação de associações para a espionagem e sindicatos da Europa, que se rege pelo programa de Citizens in Uniform, ou seja, os militares são cidadãos como os outros, mas em uniforme. Vimos os seus membros e a sua filiação, em que são 33 associações de 20 países, e a EUROMIL está afiliada em diversas entidades e tem um estatuto em diversos organismos europeus. Depois abordámos os direitos sociais, numa perspectiva na Europa, que o Manu explicou bastante. Depois eu fiz um périplo ligeiro pela nossa legislação que nos concede direitos sociais. Avançámos para o associativismo e o sindicalismo, em que basicamente a diferença entre elas será a capacidade de negociação coletiva e, finalmente, abordamos esta ferramenta como sendo uma possibilidade de obter melhores condições sociais. Ora, à luz desta apresentação, portanto, a resposta, ou as respostas a estas duas perguntas, será, respectivamente, não e sim. E para não alongar mais esta apresentação e para permitir que ainda se discuta ou que se troquem algumas ideias, dou por encerrada a apresentação. Muito obrigado a todos. Manu, we are now proceeding to the second part, where people can actually address some questions and we can debate a little bit some topics. The next presentation, the next part won't be public, and this is how I end up the first part. Thank you very much.